Okay, good evening, everyone. My name's Julie Petty. I'm working with QGoat as Vice Chair, and we have an exciting webinar that we've organised with a fantastic speaker, Kathryn, who's with the University of Queensland doing some exciting work around worm and parasite management. We had some issues the other night recording the webinar, so Kathryn and I are doing this a couple of days later just to record and make sure we can circulate the recording to the members who weren't able to make it. So thank you so very much, Kathryn, for making the time to do this again, and for your commitment and interest in communicating the results to industry. It's really fabulous. So if it's okay with you, we can move across to you. Feel free to share your screen and just walk through the presentation again. Really appreciate your time doing this.
No, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. Hopefully you can see that screen.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, as Julie said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Queensland. I'm in my third year now. And for the last 3 years, a lot of my research has focused around gastrointestinal nematode infection, primarily in Queensland and New South Wales meat goats. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the results we found across numerous experiments and what that sort of means for you as a producer. And just to give a little bit of context to those results, I thought I'd just start with a slide just discussing what inspired the research, what led us down this path. And we've noticed in the last decade, there's been this really, really big growth in the goat industry. Now, this has been particularly aided by government grants for exclusion fencing to help with wild dog predation. It's also reduced grazing pressure from native wildlife. So we've seen a lot of producers out west come together with cluster fencing and things like that to branch back into small ruminant farming. We've also, obviously, with the price of goat meat through 2021, 2022, it was quite high. So a lot of people bought into the industry during that time period as well. So we've seen a lot of producers potentially diversify their enterprise, move from cattle into goats, or start to incorporate goats into their farming practices. Obviously, we all have experienced a really wet back-to-back season for the last three years now. We've had the La Nina cycle. So we've seen a lot of climatic factors influenced primarily by climate change, creating really favourable conditions for worm transmission. So we're not getting those typically dry seasons that we used to really get clear in the year. And I probably don't have to tell you, but there's a really big lack of anthelmintic products actually registered for use in goats. At the moment, there are 12 products registered with the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicine Authority. However, not all 12 of those are even commercially available to buy. And you compare that to the likes of sheep, where there's over 50 products registered. From the sheep industry, we also have existing resistance issues carry through to the goats. So goats and sheep like to share a lot of the same species of parasites. And therefore, if we've got worms resistant in the sheep and you start grazing goats on the same pasture, those goats will pick up those resistant parasites as well. So we have what we've sort of been calling a perfect storm of conditions for pockets of disease to emerge, poor welfare situations and health situations for the goats to arise, and that ultimately results in economical losses for producers along the way. So to really start the research and the project off, we wanted to start at the very beginning. And for us, that was to characterise the distribution of gastrointestinal nematodes in meat goats. This has been in Queensland and New South Wales. And we wanted to do that in a way that also explored potential influential factors along the way. And I'll touch on what I mean by that in just a moment. So this was our first research objective, really starting from the very beginning and creating a solid foundational data base to build off other projects. So for this particular experiment, we collected data from 29 farms between April 2022 and January of 2024, and you can see the distribution of those farms on the map on the right-hand side of the screen there. The little yellow dots indicate those in traditionally or historically low rainfall areas. The green is our medium rainfall areas and the blue is our high. So up on the Queensland coast and the northern New South Wales tablelands as well. So we had 18 farms in Queensland and 11 in New South Wales. And on each of those farms, we collected fecal egg counts and we also conducted larval cultures to see the species present. Now that data set is made up of about, I think I talk about it on the next slide, just over 2,000 individual goats. And across those goats, we had different breeds, including Boer, Rangeland, Kalaharis. We had F1 crosses. We also had some contender breeds in there. So we were able to examine and evaluate a whole host of breeds with their accounts. And we also collected numerous other measurements from both the goat and the property. So where I could get on farm and conduct some of these measurements myself, we took individual weight, body condition score, FOMACHA, pack cell volume percentages, age and sex for the goat. And then for each of the properties, we have information relating to property size and system intensity, stocking rates and number of goats, weather data, including temperature and rainfall. And this was really, really important. We obviously know that when we have those wetter seasons, we have worm problems and things like that. And we wanted to understand exactly what influence that temperature and rainfall has. So we've gone back and looked at it from 7 days prior to sample, 1 month prior to sample, and 3 months prior to sample. We've also looked at if they've been supplementary fed, because obviously improving their nutrition and their will improve their plane of immune response and things like that. So we've taken that all into account, and we've also looked at the parasite control history. So all animals tested in this particular experiment had not received any anthelmintic treatment for at least 6 weeks prior to that sample collection, so that we could really eliminate any bias from that. And we'll jump straight into the results for this, and I have our fecal egg count results today. So up the side of this graph, we have our fecal egg count expressed as eggs per gram of feces, and along the bottom, we've got a whole host of different locations. So as we can see, we've got a total of 2,390 individual fecal egg counts, so a really, really big, large data set we're working with. And this is actually the first update, particularly for Queensland, since 1979. So it's really, really overdue. The last data for that's now over 40 years old. So it's a very, very exciting update. There is quite a large variation you'll see in a lot of these fecal egg counts. That isn't uncommon or unexpected with these. It's all taken into account in the statistical analysis that I'll be working on. And obviously, as we discussed earlier, those fecal samples were taken over a range of time period across numerous years. And all of that will be considered in the analysis. What I sort of want to highlight on here is, particularly for some of those properties out west, in traditionally, I guess, low rainfall areas or areas where people don't usually associate worm infections with, we're actually seeing that these are, there is parasite transmission out there, and we're seeing these numbers are in quite high and significant levels of parasite infection. So we go all the way up to just over 16,500 eggs per gram in Queensland and just up over 14,000 eggs in New South Wales for those sort of top numbers. But we can see by our boxes here that a lot of those sit anyway between 1,000 and 3,000 eggs per gram. And to break that down a little bit further, I sort of looked at what percentage of these counts are actually over 1,000 eggs per gram. So the New South Wales DPI sort of worm egg count guide suggests that any count greater than 1,000 eggs per gram will start to result in quite significant production losses for producers. And we can see that over half of the properties we looked at and we examined have counts over 1,000 eggs per gram. So these parasites are in significant levels, capable of causing significant production losses. And we can look at that a little bit further as to the worm egg count threshold recommended for different species. So for Homunculus contortus or Barber's poleworm, the worm egg count threshold is between 500 and 1,000 eggs per gram. And for Trichostrongylus colubriformis or black scoureworm, that threshold is much lower at 250 to 500 eggs per gram. But we can see that already these properties are sitting well over the threshold recommended for those two species of worms. And as we know from our next graph here, those two are our predominant species experienced in both Queensland and New South Wales. So straight off the bat, we can see this big bulk of purple on the majority of this graph, and that's our Barber's poleworm. So clearly our most predominant species. That's followed by this lighter blue colour, and that's our black scoureworm. And we can see there are pockets of it where it is in quite significant numbers, almost sitting equal with Barber's poleworm. If not, it is the predominant species. There's a little bit of, you'll see this sort of darker blue colour, and that's representing Telodosargia circumcincta, or small brown stomach worm, and that's primarily in northern New South Wales, which isn't a surprise. They get a little bit of a cooler climate down there, and have had reports of that there before. And this really, really dark colour we can see is actually Oesophagostomy or nodule worm, present in a little bit of northern New South Wales, central New South Wales, and a little bit into Western Queensland as well. It was interesting that in the fecal egg counts, we also saw eggs for whipworm, didnect intestinal worm, tapeworm, and coccidia. And all of the producers who have participated in this research, when they got their fecal egg count results back and their larval culture results back, they were able to see exactly what was the range of their fecal egg counts for those individual samples, as well as the results from the larval culture. But we also let them know if we saw any of these other species floating around in their fecal egg counts and in what sort of abundance these were in as well. So they got a lot, hopefully they got a lot back from the research they participated in, and it really helped them make some informed decisions about parasite management on their properties. So
yeah, I think certainly the feedback I've heard from some of my family members who participated in this, they were really stoked with the results and stuff that came through. Was so thorough, and it was a great learning exercise for them, because they were in pastoral areas and had assumed that they did not have any worm problem. But what we sort of spoke about in the webinar the other night was that often, that's not at all the case. And some of the highest worm egg counts, I think, Beck Brayley from DAF had seen were from pastoral areas for sheep and goats. So definitely something people in pastoral regions still need to consider.
Yeah, definitely. We've seen really high numbers even out in that southern Western Queensland and things like that. And yeah, the more detailed I could be on the reports back to them, I knew they'd be able to really make some good decisions, especially with the likes of even just adding coccidia into a little count of its own, and it helps them understand that they've got these coccidia numbers ticking over, but it's not in significant levels we don't need to treat. Or maybe actually the production losses we're seeing aren't related to nematodes, but related to something else as well. So I'm really glad to hear that they found it really useful, because obviously I find the data really useful, and if I could help them, that was a really win-win situation for both of us. So we can see from the first experiment that we have these parasites in really significant numbers affecting a whole host and a whole variety of locations. So what can we do to control those parasites was our next sort of thinking and research objective. So we wanted to investigate the efficacy of a range of registered and off-label anthelmintic products against these nematodes. And that was on farms in southern Queensland and New South Wales, so that we could report back on any current resistance status or the efficacy. So I thought I'd put the experimental design and methods in so that if anyone at home wanted to sort of replicate a really mini fecal egg count reduction test, it's really simple to do, and you can sort of follow these as a basic guideline, I suppose. So we used 15 animals per treatment group. That just fits in with the recommended guidelines for conducting these tests. And we used 1.5 times the recommended sheep dose for any product that wasn't registered for goats. So if any of the products we were using were registered for goats, we would use the dosage on the label, but anything that was off label, we would use at 1.5 times. We would collect fecal samples on our day 0, so just prior to treatment, and we would come back 14 days later for a post-treatment sample from those goats. And you can see we've got our little spread of properties down the bottom here. So we had 6 in Queensland, mostly southern Queensland, and we had 6 in New South Wales, and that extends from the northern New South Wales tablelands all the way into central and western New South Wales as well. So we tested 10 products on these properties. So we tested 4 single active orals. We've got avermectin, moxidectin, levamisole, and fenbendazole. We then decided to also test 2 single active porons. So we tested duramectin and epimectin, and these were backline. We also looked at the 2 dual actives. So we looked at monipantal and abamectin and daquantal and abamectin. Now monipantal and daquantal are the 2 newest compounds registered over the last couple of decades now for control of parasites in livestock. We also looked at a triple combination of levamisole, oxbendazole and abamectin, and our quadruple formulation with abamectin, closantel, levamisole and albendazole. And I just want to point out, just be mindful when using any product with the likes of closantel or levamisole that the safety margin for those in goats is quite narrow. So if you are using it off-label, make sure you do listen to your vet about the recommendation of the dosage, because an accidental overdose or not dosing according to weight can cause some serious issues in the goats with toxicity. So that's why all of ours were done at 1.5 and under veterinary guidance too. So to provide a little bit of context to what we were using as a bit of a classification guideline, the World Association for the Advancement of Veterinary Parasitology released new guidelines last year, so a really up-to-date version. And we compare the efficacy of the product now to when it was first released, and for all of those products, it's 99%. We've also now got to include the likes of an upper and lower 90% confidence interval in these classifications. And what that sort of leaves us with is 3 potential classifications. So we've got susceptible, where the parasites are going to die from that treatment and it's working. Resistant, obviously the population of parasite no longer is affected by that control measure, or low resistant. And low resistant is sort of on that cusp between the two. So indicating a little bit of a warning, I guess, that the continued use might cause some issues and resistance problems. So these sort of criteria will make a little bit more sense on my graphs. So if we jump into abamectin, the 2 lines, these dotted lines you see here, that's our lower 90% and upper 90%. And we've got our fecal egg count reduction on the side here and our percentage, and our properties have been anonymized, so we've just got some letters down the bottom. But right away for abamectin, we can see that the majority, unfortunately, showed resistance to this product. So we had 7 sites were resistant, and 1 property fell into that low resistant classification. So no longer susceptible, but just in that low resistance sort of warning sign. And so anecdotal evidence, we're talking to that producer, they don't use abamectin by itself, and they don't plan to try and preserve the longevity of that product there. But this low resistance was actually in a sort of central New South Wales property. But it's clear that that resistance is present across both Queensland and New South Wales. Moxidectin, we saw a little bit more of a mixed result. So we had 3 properties that still fell into a susceptible class. 3 fell into this low resistant class, and 4 were resistant. So very mixed results for moxidectin there. And one thing I want to point out is some producers will know that moxidectin itself is available in obviously the oral formulation, but you can also buy it as a long-acting injectable, registered for sheep, but a long-acting injectable. And we've had quite a few questions about that. Now, I can't comment as to the efficacy of that injectable because we just tested the oral formulation. So, and more tests would be required to understand exactly how well that long-acting is working. But just for the oral, that's how well it has performed across the variety of sites. And I do know, I think moxidectin is also available in a pour-on formulation as well. But again, I can't comment as to the efficacy of that with just having used the oral product. We move to fenbendazole, which unfortunately, very, very clear, resistant across all 8 sites. Now, this is a very old broad spectrum compound. There is widespread resistance to it in the sheep industry. So seeing this same level of resistance in the goats wasn't really a huge surprise, but we wanted to test it anyway and just see if it was going to really match up with the sheep industry, which it clearly has. So we didn't see any success using fenbendazole. Levamisole was our next single active, our last of our oral single actives. And similar results to abamectin. So it was resistant on the majority of sites, 8 out of 9 sites, but a low resistant classification on 1 site. And this particular site was in Western Queensland. So Again, they don't use this by itself. They want to preserve the longevity of this particular active ingredient out there, but clear indication that there is large levels of resistance to levamisole out in the goat industry, which again matches quite well to the sheep data. Now, I didn't pop them in here, but the pour-on formulations of doramectin and epramectin had similar results to fenbendazole. We saw no efficacy across any of the properties for either of the two pour-ons tested. So I apologise to any producers that wanted to use pour-ons to save time and having to orally inject all of their goats, but unfortunately no success was seen with either of those two in this particular trial. We move on to the dual actives. So first up, we have monipantal and abamectin. Now, this product was particularly interesting to us. It's one of the newer ones released, sheep registered, but it came out in 2010. So relatively new to the market. But it was quite concerning that although we did see some good susceptibility with 6 sites, we're seeing at least 1 resistant site and 4 low resistance sites. So we can see that this resistance is creeping in to both Queensland and New South Wales. So we've shortened the graph down here just because we're working at sort of the top end of the efficacy spectrum. But we've obviously got 1 property showing clear resistance to it and 3 that are sort of teetering on the edge, shall we say, of losing efficacy with that particular product. But it's really good to see that the majority of properties still had susceptible parasite populations to that. Our second dual active, Daquantal and abamectin, again, sort of mixed results. So we had 8 properties susceptible, which is really good. That was the majority of our properties. But we had 2 low resistant sites and 2 resistant sites. And now this is our newest product onto the market, released for sheep in 2014. So really concerning now that we have 2 confirmed sites of resistance, but also 2 emerging sites with this low resistance classification. And this is going to be a sort of first report of this resistance in in goats in Australia. So it is a concern, especially being one of our newest products onto the market, and is just really highlights the importance of not overusing some of these chemicals and rotating through a selection of active ingredients to try and preserve them, because we don't want to see this resistance or that lack of efficacy sort of spread through the goat industry. We then move to our triple active formulation of levamisole, oxbendazole and abamectin. We had 5 susceptible sites, and that was across both Queensland and New South Wales, 4 low resistant sites and 2 resistant sites. So again, we can see that we're starting to creep into some dangerous territory with this low resistant classification across quite a number of those testing sites, and a clear reading of 2 resistant properties as well. But overall, still seeing quite good results with these at least dual and triple active ingredients products. Our last one was our 4 active ingredient product, which was abamectin, closantal, levamisole and albendazole. And similar results to our triple active there. 5 properties with susceptible worm populations across both Queensland and New South Wales, but low resistance and resistance detected in both states as well. So it just goes to show that it is still resistance creeping through, and just to be mindful with the use of, especially this 4 active, it is usually recommended as more of a quarantine drench to try and avoid using it too much for just treatment throughout the year.
What do you mean a quarantine drench as opposed to any other sort of drench? Sorry, ignorant question.
Yeah, so I was having a chat with I think it was someone down in New South Wales, and we were sort of discussing this particular, or maybe it was up north, this drench, and more so used for when bringing new goats onto the property, sort of quarantining them, obviously keeping them away from your existing stock, providing them with a drench that's really going to sort of clear out any of the worms that they're holding into that quarantine paddock.
So you can just use your normal drench that you've been using?
Yeah, you absolutely can.
Okay.
Absolutely in. Yeah, this was just, it's sort of been recommended as that purely because it's got those 4 active ingredients.
Right.
So you're just sort of hitting the worms.
Everything. Yeah.
If that makes sense, but you absolutely can use anything, absolutely anything. It's just with those 4 active ingredients.
What's actually effective on your property. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think too, the other interesting point that came up out of the webinar the other night was that there's that risk with the goats you're bringing into the property, you are inheriting resistance issues. So I think you'd highlighted some of the results looked hinky, but it was because this person had brought in goats and purchased them, not realizing that they were already very resistant to the worm lobe was very resistant to the product they were originally using. So they unfortunately brought a significant problem onto their property. So I think that's worth noting in terms of people just being aware of what they're bringing in and talking to the person they're buying the goats off of to understand what they've been using. Has it been effective? Have they been doing their own worm egg counts? So
definitely, yeah. So. That was yeah, no, that's a good trying to remember back to what I was talking about on Tuesday night. But yeah, those 2 resistant sites we saw for Dequantal and Ivermectin were in New South Wales, and yeah, one of those properties hadn't used this product before, so they were obviously very concerned as to that resistant status, and we could only sort of put it down to the fact that they had brought goats in where they were unfortunately carrying some resistant strains. So yeah, really it's a very hard problem to combat without sort of having a resistant profile for every sort of goat or place you buy your goats from, but trying to maybe find out as much information as possible from whoever you're purchasing goats from as to treatments they have been given, understanding if something's maybe been used quite frequently, if it might be something you want to test and avoid. Yeah, really trying to find out as much information as you can about previous parasite control history, because if you bring those goats onto your property and they're dropping those worms in paddocks that you're going to be grazing your other goats on and things like that, you will just spread and import that resistance through, which is where the likes of the quarantining of goats and giving them something that is effective on your property and hopefully effective for them as well is going to clear them out prior to placing them in with your existing stock or on not so much your quarantine paddocks, but out on, you know, your paddock rotations and things like that. And we broke down the results further to look at what were the predominant resistant species. So we took those pre and post treatment larval culture samples so that we could see how well those products had not just worked in general, but on our worm species. And we only detected 2 resistant strains. So our 2 resistant strains were Haemonchus contortus and Trichostrongylus colubriformis. So our black scourworm and Barber's poleworm. So I just want to draw the attention when you look at this table to the percentage is quite an easy number to read. So that percentage is the number of properties where this first column is Barber's poleworm, second is black scourworm, is still susceptible to that active ingredient or that combination of treatment. So we can see for these first lining, for example, very few properties with Barber's poleworm susceptibility. So the majority of the properties have resistant Barber's poleworm to ivermectin. So that's how you sort of interpret this table. What's interesting is when we scoot down to our combination at our multi-active ingredient products, is we start to see a little bit of a shift. So we see more resistance in Barber's poleworm than we do in the likes of black scourworm. So that's just quite an interesting finding to note and something we can look at sort of further. But the majority of resistance in those multi-active dual, triple and quadruple combinations are to Barber's poleworm. And I've snuck an 11th treatment in here, this second triple active with levamisole, moxidectin, and albendazole. Now, the reason I didn't put that in the graph just yet is this was only added to the experiment a little bit later on. So we've only tested it on 3 properties, but we have seen good results. So on all 3 of those properties, worms were still susceptible, so it had a really, really good efficacy. And we've also seen that it had 100%, like 100% efficacy rate on both species. So some really promising results for that triple active combination there as well. We just can't make the same sort of jumps and conclusions and assumptions about it when we've only tested on 3 properties compared to others where we've tested on 11 or 8 or 9 properties. So just to sort of summarize what I'd just sort of talked about in that research objective there, we've obviously seen that really widespread resistance to single active ingredient products with emerging resistance to dual and combination drenches. And what I want to mention is every property had differing levels of resistance, a different profile of what worked and what didn't for them. And that's really, really important because even some of those properties were, as the crow flies, really, really close. They're neighbouring properties, all with goats, but they all had different drench resistance profiles. Some stuff worked for others, didn't work for their neighbour. So just because a product or a drench works for your neighbour or your breeder or someone you buy your goats from or you talk with in your area doesn't necessarily mean that that product is then going to work the exact same way on your property. So if you can, just running these little drench tests with a number of goats, collect a fecal sample prior to treating them, 14 days later, another fecal sample, and do your fecal accounts before and after, just to get an idea of how well that is actually working on your property. And that's the only way you're going to know for certain if something is actually working for you. So please don't just rely on what's working for someone else is going to work for me, because that's not the case. And we've also, obviously, just touching on the last slide there, we've got our 2 resistant strains present in both Queensland and New South Wales, and that's Barber's poleworm and black scowworm. So that was sort of the, finished up with that last year, and we thought, well, now we've obviously looked at what worms exist out there, the control measures for them, and we wanted to look at, well, what's going on in the goat with an immune response and things like that in a time in their life when they're under quite a lot of physiological stress. And for us, that meant having a look at the periparturient doe. So that we looked at from pregnancy through to lactation. So what we did is we looked at, we had a trial site out at Gumbunji in Queensland with Bordeaux goats. And we looked at 4 different groups of does. So we had our control group, which was our empty does, the non-pregnant does. We then had a group of singles, twins and triplets, so that we could look at the effect of what happens with the multiple fetuses, because obviously the more fetuses and the more kids they're carrying, the more stress their body's under. So we wanted to have a look at their immune response amongst other parameters to natural gastrointestinal nematode infection across this pregnancy, kidding and lactation weaning spread. So really, really big, thorough trial. And I thought I would just share a little sneak peek of what we've sort of found so far. So this data we're looking at with these 2 graphs are from our late gestation sampling time point, which was on average about 30 days prior to kidding. And we've got our fecal egg counts on the bottom left here, which is our eggs per gram up the side. And what's really interesting is we have this step ladder effect as we go up. So we've got our empties, our control down the bottom with still got worm egg counts. But as we go up to the singles, twins and triplets, the number of egg counts and parasite infection they have increases. So we can clearly see from those fecal egg counts that the number of fetuses they're carrying has a significant impact on infection levels. And we compared that with our hematocrit percentage. Now, this is the percentage of red cells in the blood. So we know that Barber's poleworm is a blood-sucking parasite and causes issues with anemia. So what we'd expect to see, and what we did see with this hematocrit percentage, was our step ladder going in the opposite direction. So the lower the hematocrit percentage, the more anemic the animal is. So we've got our our empties first with sort of the higher hematocrit percentages, and we go down to our single, twins and triplets. So it matches really perfectly with what we saw with the fecal egg count data. And preliminary sort of statistical analysis of this has shown that there are significant differences between the empty does and those with multiple fetuses. So there are statistically significant differences, which is really, really important in the field of research. So this was very exciting to see. This is, again, this sort of data and research has been conducted on sheep in Australia, and it has been looked at in goats overseas, but we don't have any of this sort of data originating in Australian goats. And that's really, really exciting that we can provide this to the industry, because it will have some really beneficial results and outcomes for producers. And I sort of summarize what I've still got left to do with that research that hopefully will feed back in my results to help with control and management of pregnant does. So we want to analyze those relationships between the worm infections and obviously our different variables, our number of fetuses and things like that, so we can better understand those effects and the risk at which the doe is at high level of infection from the parasites. But at what time points? You know, is this all the way through pregnancy? Is this just in lactation? At what point does this really become sort of a flashing sign of, hey, the doe is now at serious risk? We're also going to assess the immune response of those does. So we've collected all of our blood samples and things like that now, and we're going to look at our immunoglobulin levels, and that will include the likes of IgG and IgA, so those immune responses, what's going on at a deeper level between those different treatment groups. We've also got full white blood cell counts for all does in the trial, so that includes our eosinophils, neutrophils, basophils, and many other white blood cells, so that we can see, again, is there any difference going on at this level in the does. Now, those does were also supplemented through late pregnancy and lactation, so we want to see that, sort of characterize, I guess, the effect of that nutritional supplementation on the does. To see if how well we can improve their immune response and their sort of resistance and resilience to parasite infection during those really critical time periods. And we're going to use some exciting new sort of scientific method here involving some metabolomic analysis. So this is looking at a panel of 500 metabolites in the goat's serum from the blood, to see if there's anything upregulated or downregulated in those does. So this hasn't actually been done on goats anywhere in the world. There's been some metabolomic investigation to other things, to other various sort of things to do with milk and sort of fat and things like that. In goats, most of the research originates from actually cattle and pigs. So this is actually the first investigation looking at, can we use this as an avenue to look at nutritional supplementation with parasite interaction? So very, very exciting space there. And we're also going to use it to investigate this potential for fetal programming. And that's looking at what we do to the doe during pregnancy. How does that affect the kid later on? So again, very exciting sort of new-ish science, not really looked at in the same way we're looking at it in goats in either Australia or worldwide. And we're hoping that we might see, you know, is there something to do with parasite level early on in pregnancy that has actually got an impact on, for example, the weaning weight of the doe's kids or something like that. So we're sort of exploring those avenues as well with that research. I did sort of note that I will be at the Pinnacle Bull Goat Expo on the 21st of February in St. George if anyone wants to pop in and has any questions or anything like that for me. And I just want to, just a couple of take-home messages. But just before I jump into that, I just wanted to highlight, I skipped over it on Tuesday night as well, and I've done it again tonight. But back to my the first research objective with the egg count distribution and things like that, I'll also be looking at those influential factors. So just to give it a little bit of context and overview, we'll be looking at, does breed have an effect? Does age have an effect? Weight, body condition score, do any of those have an effect on those fecal egg counts? But then how well is the relationship between our pharmacia, our evaluation of the colour of the eye membrane in their eyes, related to actual anemia percentages in the goats, looking at those relationships to see how effective of a tool it is. We're also looking at, does stocking rate influence this? Obviously our temperature, our rainfall data, and things like that. So we really are going to be pulling that data apart to try and analyze it in as many ways as possible as to what are the potential influences on these fecal egg counts, so that that result can be fed back to producers in a way that maybe you need to be mindful of this, or if their weights are this, then you might have problems with this. So we're really hoping to break it down to that sort of level, so that there are some really, really key take-home messages from that particular data set as well. But I'm still ongoing with that analysis, and similarly with the pregnancy data and that trial as well. Still breaking down that data a little bit further, but hoping to be able to put that into a nice snapshot take-home messages the way the resistance data has. So just some take-home messages from the presentation in general. Obviously use fecal egg counts to help assess whether there is a need for anthelmintic treatment. We've spoken to some producers who just have a cycle and they just treat on their cycle without getting those egg counts done, and that's a very quick way to lead you to resistance issues. So really get those counts done and look at that and decide whether or not the goats actually warrant a treatment. Because if the counts are quite low and the goats are looking really good, then you can probably just leave it for a little bit and save those chemicals. Obviously, like I said in the resistance sort of section, consider performing your own mini drench resistance tests. And just because it works for one farm doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for yours. Always make sure when you're using anything that is off-label for goats, so registered for another species, that you do obtain that prescription, and especially talking with the vet to look at the correct dosage of that product, not only from the perspective of toxicity issues with the goats, but from the perspective of obviously meat residues as well. We don't want to end up with any issues in our export industry, for example, where we've got residues over a sort of accepted threshold. And then what I found when I've been sort of talking with producers throughout this whole journey is the more that they learn about key features of the worm transmission and life cycle, and the more they could understand exactly sort of how long it takes for eggs to hatch out, or what influence the season would have, or ground cover, or things like that, it really helped them to create sustainable practices that were best suited to their property. So obviously I can't just give you a blanket sort of recommendation, because in Queensland alone we've got all sorts of climates and things like that, and that all needs to be taken into consideration with this. But the more they could understand that, the better that they could implement sustainable and non-chemical control practices, such as cross-species grazing or paddock rotation, paddock resting, things like that, that then ultimately reduce their need to reach for those drenches and things like that. And I know Paraboss and Wormboss both have a really great sort of resource network for that, and I'd highly recommend jumping on there for just some really nice summaries and overviews, and I think you can even select your location and things like that online, which will really, really help to help understand the worm transmission and life cycle in your specific area as well. So I think that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I know that obviously it's a recording, but if there are any questions or it's raised any comments or anything like that, you are more than welcome to reach out to QGoat for my email, or I think my email exists on some MLA reports or something like that, and ask me any questions or anything like that you have. I'm happy to help after the fact, after the presentation. So, but yes, I really hope it was really useful for everyone and they got something out of it. And Julie and I were discussing the other night that we could run one of these another time later in the year, when I've got some more of those results consolidated from the influential factors for distribution, as well as summarize some more of that pregnancy and immunological data as well. And hopefully I could feed those results back to you later in the year in a really nice format that is applicable to your everyday sort of farming and things like that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This this project's sensational, and I love the focus you have on taking the R&D and translating it to a practical output for a producer. If people were still interested in contributing to the objective one, which is those individual reports going back on their property, they need to have those samples into you by the end of February, is my understanding, and they can get in touch with you because the PhD project has unfortunately run out of funds for the postage component. So it's a small fee just to cover the postage, which will be under $20, but it's well worth the effort in doing that. So I'm certainly going to do that as well. But yeah, I think so there's still opportunity for people to contribute and get some of those feed into the results for the broader project and get an individual report back on your own situation.
Definitely, yeah. I have to eventually cap it, so that's why we've extended it to the end of February, so that I do have time to analyse it and everything like that. And yeah, unfortunately, as sort of projects do, the funding pool has run dry. But yeah, producers are happy to cover the cost of an express postage bag to the lab. I'm more than happy to run those full counts, larval cultures, everything, and they can reach out and get in touch if they're interested.
Yeah, the sooner the better, because obviously with the 2-week gap between the samples, people need to start getting onto that ASAP, so they can meet your deadline. Fantastic project. Love the work you're doing. Would love to do another interview with you later in the year once you've got a few more results coming through. I think what you're doing is absolutely sensational and will save lives. So really amazing. But thank you so much for giving us the time in recording this again, and we will certainly encourage our members to reach out to you and participate in the project. If there's anything else we can do to help support the project, please let us know. It's
thank
sensational.
You. Yes. QGoat's been amazing. They've helped with the recruitment of, I think, about 8-10 new producers towards the end of last year. So that helped immensely.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Cool. Well, I will press stop on the recording. I don't know how to do that. Hang on. Stop recording.